So, you may have a few Uruk Hai in your collection, or you may have just purchased the 𝐒𝐖𝐎𝐑𝐃𝐒 Battle Host box set. Let's get these painted so you can play some games. To start with, the miniature was spray black and then grey was applied to the majority using a makeup brush. We don't want to cover all of the black here, just enough to lighten up the outer areas of the miniature. For this video, a couple passes of grey was done first before a dry brush of white was used to hit all of the edges of the sculpt. Now we can start by adding our colour. Some 𝗨𝗏𝗂𝗪 mixed with medium was applied onto the cloth, about a 50-50 mix. If you choose not to use any medium, then this paint will be more opaque straight out of the bottle. But remember, we added that texture look by using the makeup brush, and we want this to be seen, so medium it is. We are going to have quite a bit of brown cloth going on today in this video, so I'm going to show you a fair few methods of how to paint it. And you can use these methods for many evil miniatures. By mixing some dark wood and hardened leather together, we can create a different brown from our range to use, and just slap it onto our miniature's cloak. Again, don't forget to add that medium. You can layer up these speed paints, and this will allow you to control how transparent the overall colour will be. You can do this after a layer has dried, or as the paint is still wet. You do need to be careful here as it can reactivate slightly, but I talk about this more in depth in the speed paints video. And to speed things up a little, I used a hairdryer. Fun fact for you, do not forget to turn down the heat setting beforehand like I did. Otherwise, your plastic is going to go funky just like this sword blade. So let my mistake be a lesson to you. You're welcome. The same paint was applied into the shaded areas of our previous lighter brown too, just to add a little bit of depth. Afterwards, the groin armour tassel thing was given a coat of dark wood. Now for the metals. They were given a base coat of gunmetal, and it is wise here to be careful and not get any onto the painted cloth areas that we have achieved so far. If you do make a mistake, then it would be best to paint over with a close match from the normal acrylic paint range. Otherwise, you would have to paint it grey and or white, let it dry, and then apply the speed paint again over the top, which is a bit time consuming. The gloves and boots were picked out afterwards with Gravelord Grey. No medium was used as we are going for darker tones here. And then the belt and straps on the miniature were painted with Grim Black. You can see from earlier that some cheeky brown paint did make its way onto the straps, but this doesn't really matter as the darker paint will cover that up. I find you don't have to be 100% neat when using these speed paints from light to dark, but if it was the other way around, this darker layer would certainly show through the lighter colour on top. With the black paint still on our palette, some water was added to make it into a wash. This will thin down the paint a considerable amount, and it makes a great colour to apply over our metals. I find doing this with the speed paint medium doesn't quite have the same effect, and I can save it for other duties. So, water for the win here. A quick blast from Harry the hairdryer and we are ready to paint some Uruk Hai Skin. For this, some Crusader skin with a bit of purple alchemy, again about a 50-50 mix, was the colour I chose for this, just to give it a reddish hue once finished. Yes, I know the colour looks a little bit vibrant here, and he looks like he's been out in the sun for a week, but it does dry a little bit more muted than this. And to give it a slightly desaturated appearance, some holy white was added as layers onto the muscles to bring them out a little bit more. It is important here to not do too many brushstrokes in one area, as this paint can reactivate the previous layer. So with just a few brushstrokes, this was left to dry. You can always go in afterwards with a secondary layer if you wish to, and try dabbing the brush instead of using fine brushstrokes to create a slight mottled effect to the skin, just like I did here. Lastly, some thinned down acrylic black paint was added into the recesses to create a shadow line between the different surfaces of the miniature, to make them a bit more defined. This is an optional extra, but it only takes a few seconds to do so it's well worth it. Overall, this miniature took around about 15 minutes to complete, and it's good enough for a tabletop standard quality. The second scout was base coated over black with some Rhinox hide by Games Workshop, but any dark brown will do for this, as it will serve as a dark underlay to all that we will do here. Using a fairly worse for wear looking brush, the metals were picked out first this time, and were patted or stippled into place. We are going for a slight uneven look to the battered orc metals, so it doesn't matter if our dark brown undercoat can still be seen. The coat that he's wearing was painted in the same manner, but for goodness sake make sure that you thoroughly clean your brush out first. You do not want any shiny metallic pigments between the bristles which will go onto the surface with the brown, unless you want to give him a sparkling coat. The layers were built up here with our leather brown and then monster brown. The overall aim here is to create a quick and easy texture for our cloth. At this point, don't worry about being tidy here. If some paint goes onto the skin or other parts of the cloth, then hey, it doesn't matter, as we will paint over this afterwards. We are going to create some shaded areas by applying some strong tone in and around the recesses. Again, don't worry about being neat, because we can go back in with a dry makeup brush and this will feather it out. Just prod the brush on the miniature and it will pick up any of the excess shade paint and leave the recesses alone. This is just one of many methods I use to get miniatures done quickly. It may not win you any painting awards, but it will certainly get that army down on the table faster. With the monster brown still on the palette, a smidge of skeleton bone was added to make a lighter brown colour. This is to make the cloth stand out a little bit more to the eye, and we are going to paint a highlight for the creases and the folds of the cloth. You could also entertain one of your older brushes for this task, as we are just prodding the highlights into place. See, not every miniature needs to have clean and crisp highlights painted on. So for cloth number 2. This lighter brown clothing was base coated first with some desert yellow. It's nice to have a variation of tones on a miniature here and there, otherwise they could seem a bit somewhat repetitive to paint, and sometimes uninspiring, especially if you have quite a number of these little cherubs to get through. So adding some spot colours like this throughout the units of miniatures can make them appear more interesting. Before, we did most of the work by applying layers of stippled paint. This time we are going to let the shade paints do the work for us. This will give us more depth to the cloth and a more interesting colour. Whilst this shade paint was drying, the gloves and boots were picked out with Necromancer Cloak. I just like to make use of my time here and be as efficient as possible. Or you could take a quick break, grab a cup of tea, and read a couple pages of a certain fan-made Middle-earth magazine. The metallics were then given the wash treatment with some dark tone paint. At the same time, we can do the boots and the gloves. I'm always a fan of shade paints as it transforms the miniature before your very eyes, creating quick shadows where necessary. The shield was also given a thin down layer of gunmetal, just to bring back some of that shine on the larger surface. After this has all dried, some strong tone was applied onto our cloth, but just in the recesses, for that little bit more added depth. This will make the shades a bit stronger here, as well as a few splodge marks here and there over the metallic areas, just because orcs are not the cleanest of creatures. Okay, now it's time for some cloth highlights. We can move back onto our original base coat colour and start applying the paint for our lighter areas. Some water was added to the paint to make it a little bit more translucent and thinner to apply. Again, we are going for a quick build-up of colour by prodding the brush onto the edges of the cloth and folds. You can do exactly the same method by adding some skeleton bone to make the paint lighter. This may be quite useful for characters if you want to go that little bit further with them to make them stand out over your normal troops. For the third brown of the miniature, we left the base coat of Rhinox hide and went straight into the highlights. Tan flesh was painted first here on the left, followed by centaur skin here on the right. As these colours are fairly bright over the dark brown, they were kept to a minimum and applied carefully with a fine-tipped brush. So now we can move on to the skin. Now I'm going to level with you here. Since getting the new skin tone set from Army Painter, I have not had a chance to use them yet, so this part of the video will be an entertaining discovery for us both. Just because part of painting is all about experimenting and having fun, so trying something different here would fit the theme. By adding some darker areas in random patches, I wanted this to still show through the lighter layers of paint as the colours build up. Dorado skin mixed with garnet pigment toner was then thinned down with some medium, with the intention of adding a pinkish hue to the skin tones. As I want a mottled skin texture look, the brush was prodded onto the surface to build up the layers, rather than just using brush strokes. Afterwards, the same technique was used, but just with Dorado skin and medium. Using the medium, around about 75% to the paint, allowed the colour to be fairly translucent, so you'll be able to see some of the colours from the previous layers. Finally, I used dark skin wash, and this was carefully applied into the recesses between the muscles of our Uruk Hai Scout. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the result. It's a different way to how I traditionally paint skin tones, and I got to try the new paints in this video. I'm excited to try these colours out on a variety of different miniatures for some future videos. Let me know in the comments below if you would like to see anything specific, as I do read them all. The last of the smaller areas were finished off now, and we started with the boots and the gloves. They were given a highlight of field grey. At this point, the highlights were carefully picked out with a traditional edge highlight, rather than the techniques that we have used so far, allowing the eye to process the different materials that little bit easier once completed. The belt and straps had the same treatment also. Firstly, the belt was given a black base coat to make it stand out over our brown cloth. And for the straps on the glove, they were painted brown so they could be seen over the black. Let's move on to the metals now. These were given some crisp fine edge highlights compared to our cloth earlier. And this is a good way of separating the different types of materials on the miniature. For example, we gave the cloth a raggedy worn look, but the metals come out a bit more defined and look sharp and strong. Now for some Uruk dentistry for a bit more detail. The mouth area was darkened with some mocha skin, before the teeth were picked out with skeleton bone, ready for some meat, which I hear is back on the menu. Our third Uruk Hai had the same colour palette as we used before, but we mixed it up on this one just to show how you can get a bit of variety for your troops. The skin on this miniature is going to be painted using a scale 75 skin tone set, and I really like these paints. I will add the Army Painter closest matched equivalent for you on screen to follow along. African shadow was used to apply our initial base coat, and then afterwards the skin was given a more reddish appearance by applying a thinned down layer of Indian shadow. The reason I'm a fan of these paints is in the finish that they produce. They seem to have quite a matte finish to them, and I like the way that they layer up between colours. I'm sure going forward I will have more videos to utilise the Scale 75 and Army Painter skin tone set. But for now, let's get this Uruk Hai finished. For the last layer of paint, some pink flesh was mixed down with water, and then the prominent features of the face were picked out. Using a fine tip brush, areas such as the ears, brow and nose were highlighted to give the face more shape. To give him more defined muscles for his arms and legs, a small highlight was painted on first, and then this was blended in slightly with a layer of paint. And of course, with him not wearing a helmet, his eyes were painted using a tiny brush and an off-white colour. So that's 3 ways of painting an Uruk Hai. Which one is your favourite? And what methods do you think you guys will do for yours? Now, let's say your scout did something heroic, like help a lost little hobbit from a forest, and you want to commemorate this by upgrading him to a captain. I did the classic thing of putting him on a rock, giving him a brave and stoic look. And of course the White Hand of Saruman was painted on his forehead. This was done by watering down some stone golem and painting the outline of the hand shape onto the face. Once you are happy with the positioning, then you can fill out the hand with the same paint. Should you need to, you could always cut back in with your original skin colour and refine the shape even more. And if we highlight the skin, then we highlight the hand. And this was done with some mummy robes. This was painted mainly on the brow and the cheeks. However, some paint was dotted onto the edge of the hand to make it slightly rough looking as well. For a little bit of extra detail, a kill count was added onto his bow. Hopefully, the video has given you a few ideas of how to tackle your Uruk Hai and how to get them ready for the battlefield. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on hobbying.